Imagine a courtroom where the daughter of one of the most influential attorneys in Rhode Island stands nervously before Judge Caprio, accused of reckless driving after midnight on Federal Hill, a case that unexpectedly turns from routine to riveting when she decides to represent herself. The air in the courtroom was thick with a stillness that bore down on the gathered crowd like humid summer fog. A ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, struggling to stir the stagnant air, while the muted shuffle of worn papers and the occasional creak of wooden benches punctuated the silence. The sunlight, pale and brittle through the courthouse windows, cast faint squares upon the polished oak floor. There she was, tall and poised, with a carefully styled bob and a tailored navy blazer that seemed almost an armor. Amanda Calder waited by the counsel table. Her hands gripped the edges of the polished surface, knuckles whitening. She inhaled deeply before straightening, allowing the faint trace of a confident smile to form, the kind practiced in boardrooms and elegant dinner parties, not in a courtroom wrestling with unexpected vulnerability. Judge Caprio observed quietly from his bench, his hands folded loosely in front of him. The soft flicker of recognition in his eyes suggested a man accustomed to peeling back layers, not just of legal language, but of human nature. The case on the docket seemed straightforward at the start. A minor infraction, a young woman accused of reckless driving in a district known for its narrow, winding streets and late-night bustle. But Amanda's choice to waive counsel was a curveball no one anticipated. Not the prosecutor, not her father's old rivals in the gallery, and certainly not the judge himself. "Miss Calder," Caprio's voice flowed with calm certainty, "I understand you wish to proceed without an attorney?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, voice steady, yet betraying a hint of strain beneath the refined cadence. "Very well. You may approach the bench if you wish to address any preliminary matters." She turned, the soft tap of her heels on the tiled floor a brief defiance against the silence. Moments later, standing before the judge, she extended a manila folder. "I have reviewed the officer's report," she said, voice crisp, "and I intend to question its fairness. There are inconsistencies that I believe have been overlooked." There was a polite murmur from the spectators, watchful eyes narrowing and eyebrows rising. One or two leaned forward, sensing the shift in the usual rhythm of these proceedings. Caprio nodded slowly, unperturbed. "Proceed," he encouraged. Amanda flipped through the pages, steady despite the flicker of deeper emotion unfolding within her. She challenged the timing recorded, questioned the lighting conditions on the street, even the positioning of the patrol car. Her tone hovered somewhere between measured critique and faint accusation, revealing the polished advocate beneath the uneasy daughter. As she laid out her case, Caprio's gaze drifted to the corner of his desk, where a yellowed photograph lay under a heavy paperweight. Only a sliver was visible, an old portrait of a younger man, sharp-eyed and determined, flanked by a woman with a proud smile. For a flicker, his stern exterior softened. Amanda caught the glimpse from the corner of her eye. Her lips parted, a shadow passing across her face. The courtroom seemed to hush, as if sensing a fissure in the polished veneer she had maintained. The air tightened, the pulse of tension quickening beneath the formal walls. She faltered mid-sentence, voice trailing off. Her eyes dropped to the polished wood of the bench, fingers curling to grasp a cold cup of water left untouched before her. The practiced confidence evaporated, replaced by a fragile pause that stretched palpably. The judge leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a gentle murmur. "Miss Calder," he said quietly, "what is it you see there that calls you so suddenly to silence?" The question hung in the air, a quiet echo of recognition, an invitation to acknowledge something beyond the charges and testimony. The courtroom, caught between anticipation and sympathy, waited as Amanda battled the sudden surge of unspoken memories. Her next words came soft, barely above a whisper, cracking the armor she had built around herself. I didn't expect to see that. The moment cracked open. A world collapsed and shifted beneath the weight of an old rivalry, a family name, and the fragile heart struggling to reconcile both. Judge Caprio's steady gaze held her, not in judgment, but in understanding, as the silence deepened and the courtroom braced itself for what might come next. Judge Caprio's gaze settled steadily on her as he asked, "Tell me about your father." Her breath caught, not from the question itself, but from the way it fell, soft and deliberate, like a stone skipping briefly across a frozen pond, sending ripples through her carefully built courage. She pressed her hands against the worn oak podium, nails digging into the varnished wood, trying to anchor herself. "My father," she began, voice brittle but controlled, "and Judge Caprio had their share of battles in this courtroom." Her eyes flickered upward, acknowledging that the judge's own expression remained calm, unreadable beneath his heavy brows. She swallowed. "He's one of the most influential attorneys in Rhode Island. Successful, precise, respected." A pause, the room's low hum of whispering spectators filling the space. She tightened her jaw, readying to close off any vulnerability, but the judge's next words sliced through the tension quietly. "Why are you representing yourself?" Her eyes darted briefly to the packed public benches, the mixture of curiosity, pity, judgment whispering between rows. When she answered, her voice cracked, betraying the armor she tried to wear. Because he wouldn't help me. He called me a disappointment after I left law school." The courtroom, so long wrapped in the formal ritual of justice, softened. A subtle shift passed through the audience, as if an invisible current had tugged at their hearts. Murmurs softened to silence. Even the bailiff seemed to lean forward. Interest sharpened. She swallowed, regaining her footing at the precipice of feeling exposed. "But I am not here because of some dire family drama. I'm here because I want to win on my own merits, not because of who my father is." That declaration sounded hollow even to her ears. Her tone sharpened instantly, defensive, like glass snapping. "I've prepared for this case thoroughly. I can argue the facts without his name weighing me down." Suddenly, a voice rang out from a man sitting halfway up in the gallery. A bystander with no stake in the courtroom's decorum, his words cutting through the quiet. "Sounds like privilege to me. Born with a silver spoon, but too proud to admit it." The room froze. The judge's eyes flicked briefly to the man, then back to her. For a heartbeat, the courtroom air thickened, charged, like the swell before a storm. She clenched her fists, fury flashing, until Judge Caprio spoke softly, not with the iron weight of the bench, but a human cadence layered in gentleness. Pain and pride often speak in the same tone. They can be hard to tell apart. The daughter blinked, disarmed. Her breath slowed, the fight in her dimming not out of defeat, but something else, something closer to understanding. For the first time she looked at the judge and saw not an opponent, but a person who'd known what it meant to carry invisible burdens. A silence hovered between them, vast and unexpected. Her practiced armor faltered as shadows of her father's absence, her own yearning, and the echo of her outburst all hung in the stillness. She realized then, this was not judgment. It was something more fragile and rare, being seen without pretense. Her cross-examination of the traffic officer took an unexpected turn when, after a careful build-up of questioning, She slid a tablet across the polished surface of the courtroom desk toward Judge Caprio. The screen showed a grainy but unmistakable body cam video, the timestamp blinking faintly at the corner. The clip began, an undeniable record of events from that night on Federal Hill. The officer's voice echoed crisply, narrating routine observations as she weaved through crowded streets. It was not the reckless, aggressive driver the prosecution had painted her to be. Instead, there were moments captured on tape where she obeyed signals, slowed down, even came to a complete stop to let pedestrians cross. The footage, cold and clinical, chipped away at the core accusation. Yet the sequence took a subtle but significant twist. As the camera angle shifted, it revealed something else. Her own words picked up in the audio. An admission, a slip, a half-truth. The young woman, shifting uneasily under her own gaze, felt the eyes of everyone in the courtroom. For the first time, raw vulnerability softened her spine of calculated confidence. Judge Caprio's steady gaze lingered, unblinking, as the courtroom wrestled with the tension between the visual exoneration and her admission of deceit. A pang of something like admiration, tempered by discomfort, rose among the observers. There was a bravery in laying bare a damaging piece of oneself in such a public, unforgiving arena. When the video ended, the judge's voice filled the sudden quiet. "Why present evidence that undermines your own case?" His tone wasn't condemning, merely curious, light as fallen mist, but carrying the weight of invitation. She swallowed, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. For a moment, words refused her. Then her voice came, fragile, bare. "Because I needed to face it, on my own terms, before someone else did it for me." The court, for the first time since this ordeal began, seemed to breathe alongside her confession rather than at it. Those words, a surrender not of defeat, but of honesty, shifted the energy in the room away from legal sparring toward something more profound, a reckoning with truth imposed and chosen. Her gaze flickered downward, cheeks tinged with heat. "That night wasn't just about driving too fast," she continued, voice low and uneven. "It was about wanting to disappear. From my family. From their expectations. From knowing I was disappointing them without having to say the words." Judge Caprio said nothing. He simply nodded, the motion slow and deliberate, as if to draw in the unspoken weight of her confession and hold it carefully there, without judgment. The silence stretched, not empty, but full of shared understanding. The courtroom felt transformed, less a forum of accusation and more a quiet space where the messy edges of human experience could be glimpsed, acknowledged. She remained seated, her shadow cast long by the subdued light, the crackling energy of vulnerability lingering in the air like a fragile thread, linking her sudden exposed truth to the contemplative stillness around her. There was no rush to fill the silence, no hasty rescues or interruptions. The moment hung between them, a fragile truce between the woman's shame and the judge's quiet reserve, an invitation to continue not as adversaries, but as witnesses to the complexity of pain and the fragile emergence of understanding. Judge Caprio's voice cut through the courtroom's heavy air, calm yet firm. "Miss Preston, I'd like you to step aside with me for a moment." She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as she followed, the eyes of the courtroom lingering on her retreating figure. The corridor outside was narrow, the faint hum of the building's aging ventilation mingling with distant footsteps. Fluorescent bulbs flickered overhead, casting a pale, lifeless glow on the pale green walls. The judge motioned to a bench against the far wall, and she settled into it, her fingers knotted tightly in her lap. His gaze was steady, measured, never condescending, but thoughtful. This isn't just about the case or your father's reputation. I can see the weight you carry beneath all of this. His words landed quietly, but they sparked a flurry of unsaid thoughts inside her. She swallowed the lump in her throat, edges of vulnerability brushing against the polished surface she wore in court. "I'm not here because of him," she said, voice brittle but trying for control. "I came as far as I could on my own before he shut the door." She looked down, the silence between them stretching, thickening. Outside that little chamber, she was the daughter of one of Rhode Island's most feared attorneys. Here, she was just a woman exhausted by the long battle of expectations and disappointments. Judge Caprio shifted slightly. "A decade ago, I stood on the other side of a very similar divide. It wasn't a courtroom battle, but it was a war all the same. A father and daughter who spoke past one another for years, caught in pride and misunderstanding." His voice lowered, as if sharing a guarded secret, but with gentleness that invited trust. Her eyes lifted sharply, sharp enough to halt his story in midair. "Do not pity me, Judge. I didn't come here to be pitied." The air between them pulsed with raw honesty. She narrowed her eyes, suspicion entwined with something aching beneath it. He met her gaze, unflinching. "I'm not pitying you. Pity is a stranger's glance, a word spoken without knowing. Empathy is a language spoken by hearts that have broken in similar ways. There's a difference, a vast one." For a moment, the din from the hallway outside seemed like a distant echo, swallowed by the quietness of this rare, unguarded exchange. The judge's words didn't patch her wounds, but they acknowledged their existence without judgment. She exhaled, slow and almost imperceptible. The tension settled like dust, the kind that only falls when someone finally drops the weight of pretending. "There's a loneliness hard to explain," she whispered, "being known by reputation, but not by love." Her voice trembled, the barrier between strength and fragility wavering, exposing the girl beneath the lawyer's daughter. He nodded, his face reflecting the patient understanding that only years on the bench could foster. "It takes courage to admit that, in front of yourself, let alone others. And even more to keep moving forward when that loneliness feels like company." She looked up fully then, meeting his eyes without flinching. There was no judgment there, just quiet respect. And in it, a solemn invitation to something deeper than legal battles and courtroom formalities. The corridor light cast soft shadows on their faces. Outside, the city's night breathed silently, expectant. Without a word more, she stood, her posture less rigid. The tension loosened, but not undone. "Thank you, Judge," she said quietly. "Anytime," he replied, a small flicker of warmth modifying his usual solemnity. Later that evening, she sat in her car parked along the shadowed side streets near the courthouse. The city lights blurred through raindrops streaking the windshield, cool night air thick with lingering tension. She watched the courthouse entrance, waiting, not for a verdict, but for something else she didn't yet name. To her surprise, Judge Caprio appeared, stepping onto the sidewalk with the slow, deliberate gait of a man still carrying the weight of his day. He paused when he saw her, neither startled nor dismissive, just present. She opened the door, hesitated, then stepped out. "Judge, I—" Her voice cracked, searching for the right words. "I don't know if I'm asking for advice or just something." Her hands twisted nervously, something personal. He nodded, leaning against the cold brick wall, eyes reflecting the streetlights. Sometimes, the law can't answer the hardest questions. Their breaths mingled in the crisp night air. She looked past him, toward the flickering glow of distant apartment windows, Lives lived in fragments she could barely touch. I thought knowing everything about the law would solve all my problems, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. But I'm more lost than ever. He smiled faintly, a trace of weariness in his eyes. It's the old lesson no one likes to learn. Justice isn't always the same as peace. And winning a case doesn't always heal the wounds that matter most. She frowned, fighting the urge to retreat behind her defenses. That sounds like pity. Empathy, he corrected softly. 2 words, yes, but worlds apart. His gaze held hers, steady, unwavering. Her shoulders relaxed fractionally, the first drop of understanding seeping through stubborn pride. The silence between them stretched, not empty, but charged, filled with the unspoken complexities of fathers and daughters, legacies and loneliness, the quiet battles fought behind public masks. Finally, she swallowed and nodded. The street seemed to hold its breath, the distant hum of the city a gentle rhythm beneath their stillness. "I'm listening," she said, voice low but clear. He gave a slow, approving nod, the briefest flicker of a smile touching his lips under the streetlight's glow. A silent promise that here, in this fragile moment, she wouldn't walk alone. She returned to the courtroom that morning with a different weight in her step. A quiet readiness, no longer braced for battle but open to being changed. The air hung still around the polished wooden benches, sunlight slanting through the frosted glass as the judge waited, that calm presence behind the bench never wavering. The officer she had confronted the day before sat stiffly in the witness chair, his eyes wary but attentive. When she rose to address the court, her voice didn't carry the sharp edge it had held the day prior. Instead, it was steady, a little raw beneath the polish. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I want to apologize to Officer Reynolds." She glanced toward the man, who blinked, surprised at the sudden acknowledgement. "I was defensive yesterday, and my challenge came from pain, not disrespect or arrogance. I let my frustration cloud my judgment. That is on me." A hush fell. The room seemed to inhale in unison, the unspoken shifting from adversaries to something more human. A few heads nodded quietly. No one spoke. Her shoulders, usually taut, had softened. Judge Caprio inclined his head slightly, an almost imperceptible gesture, lending her the dignity of that acceptance. She lowered herself back into her seat, eyes steady, as if the apology had lifted a burden she hadn't noticed she carried. Moments later, a subtle ripple moved through the audience as the courtroom doors creaked open. She felt it before she saw it, a tense thrum in her chest, and then her father entered. He didn't speak or look around. He merely settled into a seat at the back. His presence was a tower of quiet restraint. No flourish, no spectacle, just the weight of years spent in courtrooms and conflicts. His gaze locked with hers for a fleeting heartbeat. No smiles, no judgment, but something heavy and unreadable passed between them. She was the daughter he had called a disappointment, now standing vulnerable but resolute. Judge Caprio's gaze shifted to the man, his voice carrying a softness that surprised even the hush settling across the room. "Mr. Lawson, your reputation precedes you. You've built much in this community, shaped many battles in this very courthouse. It's not our place to revisit those days, but know that legacy is never just about victories or losses. It's about what remains after the dust settles." Her father's eyes flickered briefly, an almost imperceptible nod. It was pride and concession rolled into one silent gesture, a man acknowledging fault without losing himself to it. The courtroom felt suspended in that moment, as if the unspoken exchange between father, daughter, and judge resonated beneath every word yet to be said. Then Judge Caprio turned fully to the young woman, his tone even but firm. This court finds the evidence sufficient to confirm reckless driving occurred, though not under the circumstances initially presented. A partial fine is appropriate. He paused, then added quietly, "The penalty will be suspended on the condition that you complete 50 hours of volunteer work at the community legal clinic. This is not merely a sentence, it is an opportunity to reconnect, to contribute, and perhaps to heal." Her breath caught. The fine, expected. The suspension, unexpected. The volunteer work, a surprise that stirred something deep inside. No harsh punishment, no public rebuke. Instead, a chance to walk a different path, one lined not with judgment, but with service. She nodded slowly, the edges of uncertainty giving way to cautious gratitude. The courtroom seemed transformed, not by verdict alone, but by the human threads woven through the day. Her father remained seated, silent, watching, not with disappointment, but with a quiet watchfulness that felt like a beginning. Outside the courtroom window, the city moved on, indifferent to the small revolution that had just unfolded within these walls. But for her, it was the moment everything shifted. She would return, not as a daughter adrift in her father's shadow, but as someone ready to build a new legacy of her own. Weeks later, the waiting room of the community legal clinic buzzed quietly with muted conversations and the shuffling of worn papers. She moved steadily through the room, offering a gentle nod here, a soft word there. Faces peered up at her, some anxious, others weary, each one carrying fragments of stories she almost recognized in herself. Lost, searching, unfinished. The scent of old coffee and sanitizer mingled in the air. A battered legal textbook lay open on the counter beside her, a bookmarked page crooked, as if it had been consulted 1,000 times. She hadn't opened a book like that since law school, but here and now, it wasn't about doctrine or courtroom battles. It was about leaning toward people, listening without judgment, and piecing broken things back together, sometimes gently, often clumsily, one conversation at a time. On a quiet afternoon thick with the soft hum of fluorescent lights, the door eased open behind her. She didn't turn immediately. The rhythm of the room lulled her focus. When her eyes lifted, there he was, Judge Caprio, standing near the doorway, his presence a quiet gravity amid the everyday bustle. He had an old, familiar calm in his posture, shoulders squared but relaxed, observing without intrusion. No flourish, no courtroom authority here, just a man watching something evolve before him like a delicate unfolding. Their eyes met across the scattered papers and hastily scribbled notes. She felt a flicker of something unspoken but understood. No need for words, no need for defense. A slight, genuine smile curved her lips. It was a smile rooted in miles traveled, in wounds tended, in a cautious hope that spared no pretense. After a moment that stretched like a held breath, Caprio spoke softly, his voice threading through the quiet like a steady pulse. "Now you understand the difference between winning and healing." The simplicity of the sentence was its power, a statement devoid of ceremony but rich in truth. It wasn't a verdict, it was an invitation to a new beginning. She swallowed, the weight settled deep inside her chest, not as a judgment passed down, but as a light beginning to fracture old shadows. Outside, distant city traffic murmured through the narrow streets beyond the clinic's windows, an unrelenting current beneath the stillness of this room. Her breathing slowed, deliberate, steady, as her gaze drifted across the street to the courthouse, bathed in the waning afternoon light. That building no longer felt like an endpoint, no longer a prison of expectations or failures. It was the place where everything began to realign, where the fractures in her story found quiet room to mend. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that this path, uncertain and uneven though it was, led somewhere beyond mere judgment. It led to something more human, more needed. Resilience, crafted not by victories marked on paper, but by the courage to face what lies beneath. Caprio's eyes held hers for a long beat before he gave a subtle nod and quietly stepped back, leaving her in the soft current of the clinic's steady noise and the faint pulse of life outside. She turned back to the people waiting for help, to the faces that mirrored fragments of herself, and with a calm that surprised her, she went forward. Each small, patient act of service pressing quietly against the scars she'd carried, weaving something stronger. The room faded around her until all that remained was this moment. The fragile, unspoken promise that healing was never a destination, but a step, a breath, a choice. And in that choice, finally, she found herself.